Throughout the 2nd century BC, Rome was almost constantly at war. The Republic's territory doubled, spreading across vast new lands in Spain, Gaul, the Balkans, Asia Minor, and North Africa. An endless stream of captives poured into Italy, and by the early 1st century BC, every third person in the Roman Republic was a slave. This huge population of enslaved people, combined with the brutal conditions that they lived under, eventually led to a series of bloody uprisings. The largest and most famous of these was the revolt of Spartacus. Leading an army of slaves and gladiators, Spartacus managed to terrorize Italy for several years. Rome had to call up nearly all of its military forces to put the rebellion down. And although Spartacus was ultimately defeated, he has remained ever since a powerful symbol of the oppressed fighting for freedom. Little is known about Spartacus himself. The most likely theory is that he came from the Thracian tribe of the Medes, who lived in the Danubian steppes, and that he once served alongside his tribesmen in the Roman auxiliary forces. After the Third Macedonian War and the fall of the Antigonid kingdom, Rome gradually extended its control over the Balkans. The Thracian tribes often rebelled and raided nearby Roman provinces. In the 80s and 70s BC, the Romans launched a series of punitive expeditions into Thrace, events that may have driven Spartacus to desert. He was captured, enslaved, and eventually sold to a gladiator school. Theodore Mommsen once suggested that Spartacus descended from the royal line of Spartakids, rulers of the Bosphorian kingdom. But few historians today support this idea. The Romans rarely enslaved captives of such high rank, and in addition, among the Thracians there was a common name, Sparadoc, derived from the Thracian word spara, meaning spear. The name literally meant skilled with a spear, and in Roman sources it could easily have evolved into Spartacus. Some historians think that the term Thracian in Spartacus's case didn't necessarily refer to his ethnicity, but to a type of gladiator. In Rome, there was a class of fighters called the Thracians, who wielded a distinctive curved sword. Whatever the case, what we know for sure is that before the revolt, Spartacus was a gladiator at the school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua. He even enjoyed a relatively privileged position there. He had his own room and was allowed to live with a woman. The uprising was most likely sparked by the brutal conditions the gladiators lived under. Ancient writers don't explain exactly what triggered it, they simply note that it happened. One possible explanation comes from the Christian philosopher Synesius, who claimed that the authorities in Capua had planned to hold a set of purification games, during which all of the gladiators were sacrificed for the good of the Roman people. When the gladiators found out, they rebelled, but Synesius' story is highly questionable and rejected by nearly all modern historians. Whatever the true cause, the gladiators decided to escape. Their plan was discovered, but they managed to break out anyways. One night, they raided the kitchen, armed themselves with knives, spits, and cleavers, and fought their way to freedom. Outside the city, they came across several wagons loaded with gladiatorial weapons. They seized them, and for the first time, they were properly armed. Their first stronghold was on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. From there, they began raiding Roman villas and estates. In skirmishes with small Roman detachments, the rebels captured even more weapons and armor. Runaway slaves from nearby towns and estates soon began joining them, and their numbers quickly grew into the thousands. Leading the force were 3 former gladiators, Spartacus the Thracian, and 2 Gauls, Crassus and Oenomaus. At the time, Rome had much bigger concerns than a slave revolt. The Republic was already fighting on 2 fronts. In the west, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was closing in on Gaius Marius' last ally, Quintus Sertorius, while in the east, Lucius Licinius Lucullus was locked in a tough war against Mithridates, the powerful king of Pontus. Given the situation, the Roman authorities didn't take the uprising of gladiators and slaves seriously. To them, it was just another small disturbance. the kind that occasionally flared up in Italy and wasn't worth much attention. They saw the rebels as little more than a band of outlaws, not a real military threat. To deal with the revolt, the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber was sent with a makeshift force. It wasn't a proper legion, but a militia hastily gathered from poorly trained recruits. Even so, Glaber managed to trap the rebels on Mount Vesuvius. Only one narrow path led up the summit, while the rest of the mountain was surrounded by steep cliffs. Confident of victory, Glaber camped at the top of the path, blocking their only escape route. His plan was simple: wait them out. Hunger, he thought, would eventually force the rebels to surrender. But Spartacus and his followers came up with a clever solution. They braided ropes from wild grapevines that grew thick on the slopes of Vesuvius and used them to climb down the cliffs. Under cover of darkness, they slipped behind the Roman camp and launched a surprise attack from the rear. Now it was Glaber's army that found themselves surrounded. The inexperienced Roman soldiers panicked, threw down their weapons, and were almost completely wiped out. Glaber himself was killed in the fighting. But the victory didn't come without losses for the rebels. One of their leaders, Oenomaus, was also killed in battle. News of Spartacus's victory spread quickly across the region, and his ranks began to swell. Slaves fled in large numbers from nearby towns, villas, and villages to join his cause. Meanwhile, the Romans raised a new army under the praetor Publius Varinius. Varinius decided to split his forces into 3 groups, one led by himself and the other 2 commanded by his subordinates, Furius and Cosinius. His goal was to surround Spartacus's army once again, but because the Roman detachments failed to coordinate their movements, the plan fell apart. Spartacus took advantage of the confusion, attacking the forces of Furius and Cosinius separately and defeating them one by one. Even after these setbacks, Varinius still had enough troops to take on Spartacus directly. He surrounded the rebels' camp and prepared to starve them out. The situation looked desperate for the insurgents, but once again, Spartacus's cunning saved them. During the night, the rebels propped up the bodies of fallen comrades along the walls and at the gates to make it look as though guards were still standing watch. They left a trumpeter behind to sound signals from time to time, keeping up the illusion that the camp was occupied. Meanwhile, under cover of darkness, Spartacus and his men slipped away, sneaking past the Roman patrols. When Varinius realized he'd been deceived, he marched towards the city of Cumae, hoping to regroup and reinforce his army. There, he tried once more to attack Spartacus's camp, but his troops were routed again, suffering heavy losses, and Varinius himself barely escaped capture. After this victory, there was no force left in southern Italy strong enough to stand against the rebels. Spartacus, who had once served in the Roman auxiliary forces, knew the army's organization and training methods inside out. Drawing on that experience, he reorganized his followers in the Roman style, dividing them into large units of several thousand men, their own version of legions. These units were grouped by ethnicity to make communication and coordination easier, forming separate divisions of Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Greeks, and Syrians. Most of the rebels' time was spent drilling and training. Under Spartacus's command, what had once been a disorganized mob of slaves quickly became a disciplined, battle-ready army, one capable of standing toe-to-toe with Rome's finest legions. And soon, they would have the chance to prove it. By now, the Roman Senate finally realized that this was no ordinary slave revolt. It was a full-scale war. To crush it, they dispatched 2 consular armies, under Gnaeus Lentulus Clodianus and Lucius Gellius Publicola. Each consul commanded 2 legions, about 30,000 troops in total, including auxiliaries and cavalry. Meanwhile, Spartacus had secured control over much of southern Italy and captured several towns. His army continued to grow rapidly, attracting not only runaway slaves but also free men, impoverished farmers, city laborers, and Italians persecuted during the social and civil wars, especially Samnites. For reasons that remain unclear, the two consuls decided to split their forces, likely hoping to trap Spartacus in a pincer movement. Lentulus planned to cross the Apennines and advance along the Adriatic coast, while Gellius marched through Apulia along the Appian Way. But Spartacus, thanks to his effective scouting, learned of their plans and divided his own army in response. Crassus, leading 10,000 Gauls and Germans, moved to confront Gellius near Mount Garganus, while Spartacus himself, with 30,000 men, marched to intercept Lentulus. Spartacus's plan was simple, but clever. Defeat Lentulus quickly, then join forces with Crassus, and together trap Gellius's army between them. The first part went perfectly. Spartacus intercepted Lentulus before he could cross the Apennines. His light infantry launched constant hit-and-run attacks on the Roman column, which stretched for nearly 15 kilometers. Eventually, the Romans lost formation, suffered heavy casualties, and were forced to retreat, barely avoiding complete destruction. Spartacus didn't chase them. Instead, he marched straight toward Mount Garganus to link up with Crassus, but he arrived too late. Maybe by a day, maybe even only by a few hours. Crassus's army had already been crushed by Gellius's superior forces, and Crassus himself had been killed in battle. Spartacus immediately struck back, catching the Romans off guard as they celebrated their victory and inflicted a devastating defeat. To honor his fallen comrade, Spartacus held a great funeral near Crassus's pyre, where he staged gladiatorial games using 150 pairs of captured Roman soldiers. The spectacle outmatched anything the Romans had ever organized themselves. After that, the rebels decided to march north toward the Alps, hoping to leave Roman territory so that each former slave could return home. As Spartacus's army moved north, the rebellion spread across new regions. Wherever news of his approach reached, uprisings broke out. Slaves smashed their chains, killed their masters, and fled to join Spartacus's swelling ranks. The Romans tried several times to block the rebels' advance, but each time the slaves came out on top. One battle in particular stands out, the Battle of Mutina, where Spartacus crushed a force of 10,000 men, led by Gaius Cassius Longinus, the father of one of Julius Caesar's future assassins. Eventually, the rebels reached the Alps. The road to freedom was open before them, but at the last moment, Spartacus turned his army around and marched back south into Italy. Why he did this is still a mystery. Some ancient writers claim that his men, drunk on victory, demanded that he lead them on Rome itself. But that story probably says more about Roman fears than about Spartacus's real intentions. It's unlikely he ever planned to attack the city. Another theory is that the rebels simply didn't want to leave the rich lands of Italy, preferring to keep raiding its fertile countryside, or even to establish their own state in Sicily, where slaves were especially numerous. Some historians also think Spartacus might have been trying to link up with the rebel general Quintus Sertorius, and turned south only after learning of Sertorius' death. Whatever the reason, the fact remains. The rebel army once again headed south. The march was swift and relentless. Spartacus ordered all prisoners executed and the pack animals slaughtered to keep the army light. And he temporarily stopped accepting new recruits to maintain speed. His goal was clear: to reach the rich, fertile lands of southern Italy as fast as possible, where feeding and supplying his army would be much easier. Panic swept through Rome, the kind of fear not seen since Hannibal's invasion. The combined army under both consuls tried once again to intercept Spartacus, and once again, it was completely destroyed. The battle-hardened ranks of former slaves cut through the Roman lines like a hot knife through butter, and the legionaries broke and fled. Rome's situation was desperate. Its best troops and most experienced generals were far away, fighting Sertorius' forces in the west and the Mithridates in the east. What the Republic needed was a commander who could rebuild discipline, rally the troops, and take the fight to Spartacus. But no one was eager to take on such a dangerous task until one man stepped forward, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Crassus possessed immense wealth and influence, but he lacked what he wanted most: military glory. Without it, he felt he would never truly earn Rome's respect. He was given 6 legions in addition to the 2 consular armies already in the field, but his first encounter with Spartacus ended in disaster. Crassus sent 2 legions ahead under Marcus Mummius, ordering him to move behind Spartacus's army and avoid direct combat. But Mummius, eager to win glory for himself, disobeyed and attacked head-on. The result was catastrophic. Both legions were crushed, and 2 legionary eagles were lost, a humiliation beyond measure for any Roman commander. Seeing the maneuver had failed, Crassus ordered the rest of his army to retreat. It was now clear how low morale had fallen. The soldiers were demoralized by repeated defeats at the hands of men they considered beneath them. There was another problem too. Fighting slaves offered no riches, no glory, and no spoils, so few wanted to enlist. To restore order, Crassus resorted to the harshest punishment in the Roman army: decimation. Among Mummius's men who had fled the field, every 10th soldier was executed. He did the same to the 2 consular legions that had already suffered multiple defeats. The message was brutal, but effective. The troops began to fear Crassus more than Spartacus, and with fear came discipline. Once order was restored, Crassus marched his army back into the field. For a time, Crassus avoided open battle. Meanwhile, Spartacus had dug in across southern Italy, training new recruits and overseeing the production of weapons and armor. Supplying his army became such a challenge that he banned the use of gold and silver in his camp altogether. Every bit of precious metal was used to buy iron and copper for the blacksmiths, who worked day and night. But gradually, the rebels began to lose momentum. 2 major battles followed, and although Spartacus managed each time to avoid a complete rout and withdraw in good order, Crassus held the field after both. Realizing his position was weakening, Spartacus decided to break through to Sicily. More than half the island's population were slaves, potential allies and recruits for his army. Not long before, Sicily had seen 2 massive slave uprisings that Rome had only managed to crush with great effort and heavy losses. Even the island's free inhabitants still remembered the days of Sicilian independence and resented Roman rule. To make the crossing, Spartacus struck a deal with the Cilician pirates to transport his men across the strait, but when the time came, their ships never appeared. Why remains uncertain. Some say Crassus bribed the pirates. Others believe they never had enough ships to move such a large force and never intended to keep their promise. Bad weather could have also played a role. It was autumn, when sailing those waters was especially dangerous. Whatever the reason, Spartacus's army found itself stranded on the shores of the Strait of Messina. While Spartacus waited for the pirate ships, Crassus's men dug a massive trench across the entire Rhegium Peninsula, piling up an earthen wall and topping it with a wooden palisade. Spartacus was trapped, and his food supplies were running dangerously low. The first attempt to break through failed. The rebels suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat. But soon after, Spartacus managed to escape the trap. To divert the Romans' attention, the main body of his army launched an assault on their fortifications, while a smaller force under Spartacus's personal command filled in part of the trench, tore down the palisade, and broke through by force. About a third of his army escaped into southern Italy. Suddenly, it was Crassus who found himself at risk of being surrounded and began to pull back. Spartacus chose not to fight Crassus's main army directly and instead marched towards the port city of Brundisium, hoping to seize ships and escape by sea. But the city was too well fortified, and outside its walls, Spartacus ran into the forces of the proconsul Marcus Terentius Lucullus. At the same time, Pompey's legions were marching down from the north, fresh from defeating Sertorius and now hurrying to reinforce Crassus. The Roman armies were closing in from all sides. Crassus first crushed a smaller rebel force under Gannicus and Castus, And then came the final showdown. The armies of Spartacus and Crassus met near the river Silaris. According to Plutarch, before the battle began, a war horse was brought to Spartacus, but he killed it with his sword, saying that if he lost, he wouldn't need a horse, and if he won, there would be plenty of fine ones to choose from. Then, with his bravest warriors beside him, Spartacus charged straight towards Crassus, determined to reach him, and almost did. He fought his way close enough to kill 2 centurions from Crassus's personal guard before finally being cut down by Roman swords. With their leader dead, the rebel army could no longer fight effectively and was almost completely destroyed. But the victory came at a high cost. Nearly half of Crassus's men fell on the field near the river Silaris. A small group of rebels managed to flee north, but Pompey's legions caught up with them and wiped them out. Around 6,000 slaves and gladiators were taken prisoner. On Crassus's orders, they were crucified along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome. Even after the rebellion was crushed, southern Italy remained unstable for years, as small bands of escaped slaves continued to raid and plunder the countryside. The memory of Spartacus's victories lived on, inspiring slaves again and again to take up arms against their masters. Marcus Licinius Crassus had long hungered for military glory, but for this victory he only received a minor triumph, an ovation crowned not with a laurel wreath, but with one made of myrtle. Romans believed the war had been fought against an unworthy foe, and much of the credit went to Pompey, who finished off the last of the rebels. 18 years later, Crassus's thirst for fame and victory would drive him east, to Parthia, and to his death at the disaster of Carrhae. End of this video. We really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. We put out new episodes every single week. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Bellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.